Some movies don't just flop, they disappear. Pulled from theaters, erased within days, almost like Hollywood wanted you to forget they ever existed. But what kind of film fails so badly that studios panic and shut it down immediately? Behind these disasters are shocking budgets, desperate decisions, and audiences who rejected them instantly. And one of these films collapsed so fast. It barely survived its opening weekend. Mars Needs Moms, 2011. This wasn't just a family film that underperformed. It became one of Disney's most uncomfortable box office collapses. On paper, Mars Needs Moms sounded marketable. It had a recognizable studio behind it, a child-centered sci-fi premise, and a release strategy built around family audiences. The film followed a young boy who travels to Mars after his mother is abducted by Martians, setting up a story that was supposed to feel adventurous, emotional, and visually impressive. But the moment audiences saw it, something felt off. The motion capture style unsettled many viewers instead of drawing them in. The characters looked almost human, but not quite. That made the film feel strange in a way families didn't seem eager to embrace. Instead of becoming a fun theatrical event, and it quickly developed the kind of reputation no studio wants: expensive, awkward, and easy to ignore. Then came release. The numbers were disastrous. Despite a wide rollout, attendance was weak almost immediately. Theaters responded fast. Showtimes were reduced, screens were reassigned, and the film faded from circulation far quicker than a major animated release ever should. What makes Mars Needs Moms especially striking is that it didn't fail because of scandal or backlash. It failed because audiences felt no urgency to see it at all. And in Hollywood, that kind of silence can be fatal. United Passions, 2015. This film had global ambition and one of the most embarrassing collapses ever recorded. Funded with support from FIFA itself, United Passions was meant to celebrate the history of world football. It featured an international cast and aimed to inspire audiences worldwide. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. By the time it reached U.S. theaters, FIFA was already surrounded by corruption scandals. Public trust had collapsed, and the film arrived at exactly the wrong moment. Audiences didn't just ignore it, they rejected it outright. Its opening weekend numbers were almost unbelievable. In some theaters, only a handful of tickets were sold. The total U.S. gross barely crossed $1,000. Within days, cinemas pulled it completely. It didn't fade slowly, it vanished. The timing, the subject, the tone, everything collided at once. And what was meant to celebrate power and legacy instead exposed how quickly public perception can destroy a film overnight. Delgo, 2008. On paper, Delgo looked like a safe bet. It was an animated fantasy adventure, years in the making, packed with voice talent and ambitious world building. The studio invested heavily, hoping to build a new franchise from scratch. But audiences never arrived. When the film opened, the results were staggering. It posted one of the worst wide-release openings ever recorded. Entire theaters reported almost empty showings. In some locations, fewer than 10 tickets were sold per screening. The silence was immediate. Unlike films that fail after bad word of mouth, Delgo collapsed from the very first day. There was no recovery window, no second chance. Theaters reacted quickly. Showtimes were cut. Screens were reassigned. Within a short period, the film disappeared from most locations. What makes this story unsettling is how invisible it became. Years of work, millions spent. And yet, for many people, it's as if Delgo never existed at all. Not because it was controversial, but because no one was there to see it fail. Heaven's Gate, 1980. This wasn't just a flop. It was a moment that shook Hollywood itself. Directed by Michael Cimino after his success with The Deer Hunter, Heaven's Gate was given an enormous budget and near-total creative control. What followed was chaos. Production spiraled out of control, costs ballooned, filming stretched endlessly. When the film finally premiered, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Critics dismantled it, audiences stayed away, but the most shocking part came next. The studio didn't wait weeks. They didn't wait for word of mouth to settle. They pulled the film from theaters after just 1 week. It was re-edited, shortened, and re-released. But the damage was already done. The financial losses were devastating. The film became a symbol of unchecked ambition and studio miscalculation. Entire careers were affected. Some historians still point to this disaster as a turning point, when Hollywood studios began tightening control over directors again. Because Heaven's Gate didn't just fail, it forced the industry to rethink how power worked behind the scenes. The Bonfire of the Vanities, 1990. Everything about this film suggested success: a best-selling novel, a major studio backing, and a cast led by Tom Hanks and Bruce Willis. On paper, The Bonfire of the Vanities looked unstoppable. But something went wrong, quietly at first, then all at once. The film struggled to capture the tone of its source material. What worked as sharp social satire on the page felt uneven and confusing on screen. Audiences didn't connect. Critics were merciless. The reaction spread fast. Within days of release, attendance dropped sharply. Theaters began reducing showtimes, replacing it with films that actually drew crowds. It wasn't officially pulled overnight, but the effect was nearly the same. It vanished faster than anyone expected. What makes this collapse so unsettling is how unpredictable it felt. All the right ingredients were there, and yet the result was a complete rejection. Because sometimes, in Hollywood, even when everything looks perfect, the audience simply says no. Town and Country, 2001. This film didn't just struggle, it collapsed under the weight of its own production. Town and Country was meant to be a light romantic comedy with a prestigious cast, including Warren Beatty, Diane Keaton, and Goldie Hawn. On the surface, it looked like a safe, elegant studio release. But behind the scenes, everything was unraveling. Production delays stretched on for years. Reshoots piled up. Costs escalated to an almost unthinkable level for a simple comedy. What should have been a modest project turned into one of the most expensive comedies ever made. By the time it finally reached theaters, the damage was already done. Audiences showed little interest. Critics responded coldly. And within days, the numbers told a brutal story. Theaters didn't wait. Showtimes were cut almost immediately. Screens were reassigned to films that could actually bring in audiences. In many locations, it disappeared so quickly that viewers barely realized it had even been released. What makes this failure stand out isn't just the financial loss, it's how long it took to fall apart. Years of effort, endless delays, massive spending, all leading to a film that audiences rejected almost instantly, not with outrage, but with silence. The Adventures of Pluto Nash, 2002. This was supposed to be a major sci-fi comedy event. Starring Eddie Murphy at the height of his fame, The Adventures of Pluto Nash promised futuristic spectacle, humor, and box office success. The studio invested heavily, building elaborate sets and crafting a vision of a lunar nightclub empire. But something went wrong long before audiences ever saw it. The film faced repeated delays, pushing its release further and further back. By the time it finally arrived, our anticipation had faded into uncertainty. Then came opening weekend. The numbers were shocking. Despite a massive budget, the film earned only a tiny fraction of what was expected. The gap between cost and return was so extreme that it immediately became one of Hollywood's most infamous financial disasters. Theaters reacted quickly. Showtimes were reduced almost overnight. Screens were reassigned. Within a short window, the film had effectively disappeared from most locations. There was no slow decline, no gradual loss of interest, just a sudden realization that audiences weren't coming at all. What makes Pluto Nash particularly striking is how complete the rejection felt. This wasn't a risky art film, it wasn't controversial, it was designed for mass appeal. And yet it failed to connect on every level. Because sometimes, and even star power isn't enough to save a film once the audience decides to walk away. Cutthroat Island, 1995. This wasn't just a box office disaster, it was a financial shipwreck that sank an entire studio. Cutthroat Island arrived with enormous ambition, a full-scale pirate epic packed with action, elaborate sets, and high production values. The studio believed it could revive the pirate genre and dominate the holiday box office. Instead, it became one of the most infamous failures in Hollywood history. From the beginning, the production faced problems. Budget overruns spiraled out of control. Casting changes created instability. Costs climbed higher and higher, turning the film into a massive financial risk before it even reached theaters. Then came release. Audiences didn't show up. Despite its scale and spectacle, the film failed to generate excitement. Critics responded poorly, and word of mouth did little to help. Within days, theaters began cutting showtimes. Screens were reassigned to more reliable releases. The decline was immediate and devastating. Unlike smaller films that quietly fade away, Cutthroat Island collapsed under the weight of its own expectations. The losses were so severe that the studio behind it could not recover. It wasn't just a failed movie, it was a financial event that reshaped careers and ended a company's future. Because sometimes a single film doesn't just fail, it takes everything down with it. Battlefield Earth, 2000. Few films have ever been rejected as aggressively as this one. Battlefield Earth arrived with bold confidence, a large-scale science fiction epic starring John Travolta, and based on a novel that promised an expansive, futuristic story. The studio positioned it as a major cinematic event, but from the moment audiences saw it, the reaction was immediate and harsh. Critics didn't just dislike the film, they dismantled it. Reviews pointed to confusing storytelling, unusual visual choices, and performances that felt disconnected from the material. Audiences followed that lead. Opening weekend numbers fell far below expectations, and instead of stabilizing, the film dropped sharply in attendance almost immediately. Theaters responded quickly. Showtimes were reduced within days. Screens were reassigned. In many locations, it disappeared faster than most big-budget films ever do. There was no recovery period, no slow decline, just a rapid collapse driven by overwhelming negative reception. But what makes Battlefield Earth particularly striking is how confident it seemed before release. Everything suggested a major hit, but once audiences made their decision, there was no turning it around. Because in Hollywood, perception can change instantly, and when it does, even the biggest films can vanish almost overnight. Howard the Duck, 1986. This film didn't just confuse audiences, it left them asking what they had just watched. Backed by George Lucas and adapted from a Marvel comic, Howard the Duck arrived with serious expectations. It blended science fiction, comedy, and live-action effects in a way that was meant to feel bold and original. Instead, it felt off. From its unusual tone to its strange humor, audiences struggled to connect with what the film was trying to be. Was it a family movie? A parody? And something else entirely? No one seemed to know. The reaction was immediate. Critics were harsh, but more importantly, audiences stayed away. Theaters quickly felt the impact. Attendance dropped faster than expected. Showtimes were reduced. Screens were quietly reassigned to films that were easier to sell. Within a short time, it had largely disappeared from major circulation. What makes this failure so unsettling is how unpredictable it felt. It had recognizable source material, a powerful producer, a sizable budget, and yet none of it mattered once audiences rejected the experience. Because confusion can be just as damaging as dislike. If viewers don't understand what they're watching, they don't come back. And when they don't come back, theaters move on. Cats, 2019, before it even opened. Something felt wrong. As Cats was based on one of the most successful stage musicals of all time, the studio assembled a high-profile cast, invested heavily in visual effects, and positioned it as a major holiday release. But the first trailers triggered an unexpected reaction: confusion. The film's digital characters, part human, part feline, unsettled audiences almost instantly. Social media filled with reactions ranging from disbelief to discomfort. By the time it reached theaters, curiosity had already turned into hesitation. Then came the release. Critics reacted harshly. Audiences followed. The film struggled to maintain attendance even during its opening days. Theaters noticed quickly. Showtimes were reduced. Screens were reassigned to stronger performers. In some cases, updated versions of the film were even sent to cinemas after release in an attempt to fix visual issues. But the damage had already been done. What makes Cats particularly fascinating is how visible its collapse was. This wasn't a quiet failure. It happened in real time, online, in theaters, and across the industry, because once audiences decide something feels wrong, no amount of marketing can fix it. And when that moment hits, the fall is immediate. Jem and the Holograms, 2015. This was supposed to be a nostalgic hit. Jem and the Holograms was based on a beloved animated series aimed at both longtime fans and a new generation. The idea seemed simple: revive a recognizable brand and turn it into a modern success. But something changed along the way. The film's tone shifted away from what fans remembered. The stylized world of the original was replaced with a more grounded, contemporary approach. And audiences noticed immediately. When it opened, the numbers were shockingly low. Despite a wide release, theaters reported extremely small crowds. In some locations, entire rows remained empty throughout screenings. The reaction wasn't loud. It was absent. Within its first week, theaters began removing it from schedules. Screens were reassigned, showtimes vanished, and the film effectively disappeared, almost overnight. What makes this failure particularly revealing is how quickly the audience rejected the concept. There was no gradual decline, no second chance, just a clear signal that something didn't match expectations. Because nostalgia is powerful, but only when it feels authentic. And when that connection breaks, audiences don't wait. And Gigli, 2003. This wasn't just a failure. It became a symbol of everything that can go wrong in Hollywood. Gigli arrived with enormous attention. Starring Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez, two of the biggest names at the time, the film carried a level of publicity most studios would dream of. Their real-life relationship only amplified the spotlight. On paper, it looked unstoppable. But from the moment early reactions surfaced, something shifted. Critics were brutally negative, word spread fast, and audiences already curious began to hesitate. Then came release. The numbers were staggering, for all the wrong reasons. Despite massive media attention, the film opened to extremely low ticket sales. Entire theaters reported near-empty screenings. The disconnect between hype and reality became impossible to ignore. Theaters didn't wait. Showtimes were cut almost immediately. Screens were reassigned to films that could actually draw audiences. Within a very short period, Gigli had effectively vanished from most theaters. There was no slow decline, no gradual fade, just a sharp, undeniable rejection. What makes this collapse so fascinating is how complete it was. This wasn't an unknown project. It wasn't a risky experimental film. It had star power, marketing, and visibility. And yet none of it mattered once the audience made its decision. Because hype can bring people in once, but it can't make them stay. And in this case, it couldn't even get them through the door. Some movies fail quietly, but these vanished like they were never meant to be seen. Millions lost, careers shaken, studios forced to react in real time. But the real question is, how many disasters like this almost happened and were stopped just in time? Because in Hollywood, failure isn't always visible. Sometimes, it's erased before you even notice.